photography world. How are you going?
Thank you. I'm excellent and I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm a big podcast consumer and I've only ever done one before. Who knows where the next hour or so is going to go, and who on earth is going to listen to this? I don't know, but we'll see where it goes, and hopefully we can uncover some gems as we go.
Yeah, until it gets published, it's just a conversation between you and I. And
then it hits the airwaves and it's public information.
That's exactly right. But I've got a listener in Zambia. I know that much.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Why don't we start? Why are you into photography, and in particular, why are you into landscape photography? Where did all the
straight to the crux of it. Just a little bit about me before I go into kind of my photographic story. Most importantly, I'm a dad of two girls, so I've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. Yep. And they keep me on my toes. They give me a reason to do what I do, both professionally. I don't work professionally as a photographer. I work full-time as a chartered accountant and work in finance and commercial property. So that they are my big kind of driving force. Photography for me, how do I describe this? It feels like it's been a companion all of my life. And it's a very difficult relation to explain. So maybe I just throw a few anecdotes at you as well and just give you a little bit more depth to the story. So I guess as a child, my imagination had run wild. I'd always be the kid in the corner drawing, and it would most of the time be fantastical landscape vistas. I remember clearly drawing underwater seascapes or big mountain ranges with a beautiful stream cutting through the middle of it. More often than not, it involved nature. And I was also the type of kid that detested reading fiction books. Give me an autobiography, give me an encyclopedia, and I'll read it cover to cover because I've got a huge curiosity for the world.
Yep.
But you give me anything that's fiction and I just lose interest. I distinctly remember at the end of my parents' hallway, they had a big chest of drawers, and in the middle chest of drawer is where my dad kept his camera. And always as a kid, I'd sneak in and try and play with the camera. And not only that, playing with Dad's old Olympus camera, but the only family heirloom that we kept from my dad's father, and my dad's father passed when my dad was only quite young, was his camera. So we had this, I think it's a code #1 pocket camera. So it was from the 1920s.
Yep.
It's one of those folding bellows cameras. Yep. I remember sneaking into mum and dad's bedroom and trying to play with this old camera and trying to get my head around how it worked and that kind of stuff. So and that now sits proudly on my shelf at home. So I've got a couple of old vintage cameras, and that's a little bit of me and my family history sitting on the shelf, and I'm very proud of it. Then on the other side of my family, my mum's dad, I had a really close relationship with my mum's dad. Mm-hmm. He, I guess, really was sentimental in my life, really that kind of patriarch of our family.
Yep.
He was a returned serviceman from the Second World War. He was in the Royal Australian Air Force, and he served across the Pacific theatre of the Second World War. When he arrived back to Australia from the Second World War, not only did he bring back some bad memories of the war, but he also brought back a love of aviation.
Sure.
So in the 1960s, he actually bought a light aircraft, which is a Cessna Skylark 175. And some of my very earliest memories were flying on his lap in his plane around his farm, which was in the Western Downs region of Queensland. And I've got distinct memories of looking out the aircraft's window, looking at all the livestock dotted around the paddocks, and they looked like ants from above, and all of the geometric patterns of the wheat and barley crops with tire marks from the tractors going through the middle of it and all that kind of stuff. I was just really drawn just to looking down from above. Yeah. And I guess that really led me in my more mature photographic career into aerial photography. So I guess I first picked up a camera around I just finished all of my postgraduate studies. So that mountain of time that studying as a chartered accountant, all of a sudden I had a whole bunch of free time. And I thought at that point in time, I'd like to take 3 months off from work. I'd like to buy myself a new camera and go travel. I was going to go to the Himalayas and go to Bhutan, but then the global financial crisis happened.
Yeah.
Work started laying off people, as big corporates often do in those types of situations. And here I was with a Nikon D300 at the time and a whole bunch of spare time. So I just started teaching myself how to use it. So initially I was drawn to, as many people are around here in Sydney, to the seascapes.
Sure.
So around 2008, I was get up at the crack of dawn every weekend and go down to the beaches. And you mentioned earlier that you were at Longreef this morning, and I remember doing that all the time as well.
Yep.
That led to a point where I probably immaturely started to mimic other photographers, but I think we all go through a stage of trying to mimic other photographers.
Yeah, definitely.
And the most significant photographers in Australia at that point in time were Ken Duncan, Peter Lick, these big guys, big personalities shooting big landscapes. So I got drawn more and more towards doing big panoramas, to the point where I actually purchased in Fujifilm GFX 617, which was a medium format film camera.
Mhm.
And throughout the 2010s, whilst the world was on this exponential growth curve of megapixels and everyone was grabbing the newest kit, I felt every 6 months there was a new camera coming out that was doubling in megapixel counts and all this kind of stuff.
Sure.
I was lugging around this kind of 5 kilogram medium format film camera, and that really taught me a lot about photography. I really had to nail my exposure pyramid. I really needed to understand composition, because you couldn't really waste slide film, burn a hole in your pocket. And I really just submerged myself into that photographic pursuit. I was really enchanted by trying to capture primarily alpine snow scenes in the panoramic format, and trying to get those burning sunsets that would render so beautifully on Velvia slide film. And then progressively megapixel. And look, the benefit of shooting on slide film back then was the resolution of shooting on slide film was just so high. I couldn't, even if I was stitching panoramas together, I couldn't get the resolution that I could get out of a 617 camera. And just for everyone's benefit, a 617 camera means that the slide film at the back of the camera, or the size of the sensor in modern terminology, would be 6 centimeters by 17 centimeters. So it's a big whack of film at the back of the camera.
Were you doing your own development, or were you sending?
No, I was using labs. I'm not really that technically minded. I think I'm probably more not artistically minded, but certainly more, my vision was more about being in the field as opposed to getting lost in getting high on chemicals in a dark room.
The smell's not a great memory from my film days.
No, but I distinctly remember picking up my first roll of film from the lab and just being transfixed. So the slide film was a transparency rather than a negative, so it was true color. And I just remember putting it on a light table for the first time with a loupe and just looking at it going, holy dooly, this is amazing. I've made the right decision here. So it really made me slow down, take my time, and really ensure that I would nail my compositions, nail my exposures. Because, of course, on a 617 roll film, I only got four shots out of a roll of film.
Yeah.
And it was quite expensive to not only pay for the film, but also for the reproduction of them. Then I stopped shooting film at around 2015, 2016. And that's when I first picked up a digital camera, or not first picked up, but subsequently picked up a digital camera again. And then I found myself photographing more and more into the night sky and doing things that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. And at that point, I was a little bit more like a kid in a candy shop. I really didn't have a narrow view of what my artistic vision was. And that was until 2018. My wife was pregnant with our first child at that point in time. And I had this idea that I would take some aerial photographs. So we had a family holiday over in Perth, and I had the idea of going up to Hutt Lagoon. And if the baby was going to be a girl, I would take some photos of the pretty pink salt lakes.
Yep.
And she could have some beautiful pink photos on her wall. Nice. And then that same year, we had our baby moving up at Hamilton Island, and I'd go out to the reef and take some photos of the reef. And if baby was a boy, he could have some beautiful blue reef photos on the wall.
Cool.
Suffice to say, I've ended up with a house full of pink. But that really kicked off my passion for aerial photography. And I guess that's where I've really focused my photographic pursuits over the course of the last 6 years or thereabouts. And I've really tried to carve out a niche for myself. And that goes all the way back to the top of the conversation is, here I am with a love for nature. Here I am for a love of creating an art. And here I am with a love of aviation and being in the air. And I think my aerial photographic pursuit is just the sweet spot of the intersection of all of these. Yeah, so that's my photographic story in a nutshell. I'm sure we can scratch a little bit.
No, there's a couple of things I want to dive into. I guess that starting out in film and medium format in particular, how do you think that has influenced your digital work? Was it the explosion of, oh, I don't have to restrict myself? Did you go nuts and take everything you possibly could and lots of
Yeah,
exposures, or were you staying very selective?
I'm still going nuts. Yeah, yeah, I almost rationed myself for so long in terms of how many images I could take. I'd go away for a week or 2 weeks, and I'd come home with only few handfuls of film. Now, and aerial photography is so high yielding because everything moves so quickly.
Yep, yep.
I'm coming home with 1,000 images in just under an hour type
Yeah,
thing. No, it's done a complete 180. And no, but there are certain disciplines I think that it has taught me and that I've
yeah,
stayed true to. One, above all, is trying to nail my compositions. And then secondary to that is trying to nail my exposures. So
yeah,
I don't have the ability to exposure blend or anything like that when I'm flying in an aircraft, and everything happens in hyperspeed. I don't really have time to dial in the right exposure, so I've got to be really adaptive, and I shoot everything in manual, so I've got to be really adaptive to how the light changes, and it
yeah,
can change
right.
really quick in the air. So I think nailing composition and nailing exposure, whilst that is the bedrock of most photography, that is a discipline that my film days have carried over into my digital days. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a process for setting creative challenges for yourself? And do you think it's important for you to have goals in your photography? Or are you more spontaneous about it and just take the opportunity where it comes?
I'm very much goal and project driven to the point where I think it drives almost everything photographically for me.
Okay.
And very rarely do I actually do something that's impulsive or reactive. So I think if I can how I use projects, I think it's almost like a tiered approach. I've got this macro project that I've been working on, and to be honest, I think I'll always be working on it. And that's what I call Above Australia, but it's trying to document ultimately the outcome of the project. I would like to be a fine art coffee table book, but it's essentially driving everything that I'm doing in terms of trying to cover most geographic regions of Australia.
Yeah, right.
So, for example, I've had the luxury of photographing a lot in Western Australia,
Mm.
photographing a lot in South Australia, but more recently I've had to look closer to home in New South Wales which has been a little bit more tricky, to be honest, from an aerial standpoint to identify locations to fly aerially, just to
Okay.
ensure that there's coverage across my portfolio and the portfolio is complete. Similarly, I've been involved in a collaboration with a couple of other photographers, David Dillenberg and Paul Holland, and we've together called ourselves Altitude South. And that has driven a lot of project work from a photographic standpoint over South Australia. So we've done a couple of big trips in a Cessna 182 from approximately Adelaide all the way up to Birdsville and back across the South
Okay.
Australia.
Yeah.
And what has driven that is we've really wanted to document the modern legacy of the human impact on the landscape across South Australia.
Yep.
We've want to have a look at the ancient legacy of geography and geomorphology, how the geography and geology of South Australia has come together. So we're just having a look at different salt lakes, different mountain ranges, all through the Channel Country. The pastoral legacy of the early farmers that have gone out to some of these remote locations out in the Channel Country,
Yeah.
and of course the Indigenous legacy of the first Australians and their connection to the country. That has been a project that has driven a couple of trips, and hopefully we've got a few more coming up too.
So has
And
that
then
all been aerial work or has it
yeah,
been?
that's all been aerial work. Dave Dellenberg, who I'll actually recommend as someone that you speak to later
Sure.
on in the podcast, has a fantastic relationship with pilot Steve. We've got access to a private plane,
Nice.
and we, over the course of the last couple of years, have racked up about 40 hours of flight time over South Australia. It's entirely aerial based, and we've explored some incredible things. We've seen the Simpson Desert and flood.
Yep.
We've had some pretty hairy experiences up there as well. We're in a place called Bettery, which is in remote southwest Queensland,
Okay. Yeah.
and the flood waters had made the town of Bettery into an island. And we had flown in, and of course, when the floodwaters in the outback explode, there's an explosion of life. All of the explosion in the insect life has resulted in a huge amount of birds, and we were flying in and the sky was almost black with birds. And of course, bird strike in a light aircraft can be fatal.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. Yeah.
So yeah, it was wasn't very comfortable watching our pilot turn the palest shade of white I've ever seen a human turn, but he managed to do it very well. But yeah, that project has yielded some incredible imagery and some incredible experiences. Beyond that, so I've gone from what's driving me at a macro level all the way down to individual projects. So if I can just give you an anecdote from an experience that I had up in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, sure.
In September 2022, I was fortunate enough to charter a flight over remote coastal region of the Northern Territory.
Yep.
And my goal for that charter was to document an area that I had identified on satellite imagery, which appeared to be swathes of black swampland, and it was littered with dead trees.
Yeah.
What could it be? And my curiosity was engaged, and I found no references to it online at all. And as we approached this dark, desolate swamp land, the cabin fell quiet, and my pilot was like, what on earth are we flying over? And it was just this utterly remarkable landscape that was unveiled below us. What it turned out to be was 17,000 hectares of what they call salt. So salt water had come into a freshwater swampland. And that was the result of a number of factors that have come together in a cocktail and essentially killed off an ecosystem. So the introduction of water buffalo into the territory with their hard hooves on the soft mangroves has chewed up some channels that has allowed salt water to inundate into the freshwater swampland.
Okay.
And then obviously rising sea levels also have contributed to that. It was pretty ghastly to see, to be honest, but what it enabled me to do was rely on a series of images and put the series of images together to have a more of a powerful statement about what I witnessed. If one image can tell 1,000 words, as the old adage goes, how many words can 10 images together make?
Yeah.
And so that was my little project there. So everything that I do from a photographic standpoint, I feel is project driven and goal orientated. Yeah, and that's just a couple of anecdotes to
cool. Where did it start to become art for you, as opposed to documenting what you're seeing? Or is it still documenting what you're seeing?
It's both. In hindsight, so my ego would always have said it's always been art. But I now know that's not a true statement.
Yeah.
So the power of looking in the rearview mirror and just thinking about my photographic journey. Look, there has always been elements of art, but it comes down to how you define art and what is art.
Yeah.
There was a point that really hit me hard, and that was when we launched our Altitude South exhibition in the Barossa Valley last year. Mm-hmm. It's the first time I had been in a venue that was made for artists, and we hung photographic work on the walls. And the feedback that we had from the local artistic community was incredible. We had people in tears. We had people write poems about our work. And that really made me reflect and think, yeah, what I am doing is art.
Yeah.
Whilst it is documenting, it is absolutely documenting. I'm not going to get away from that. I think the most amazing artists in the world is Mother Nature. But I do have a photographic voice. I do have an artistic voice, and how I compose my images is absolutely art. I'll give you a couple of instances of how I think it is. So most of my aerial images, there is no reference point of the horizon.
Yep.
And that's a conscious decision for me to remove that reference point. And what that then enables the viewer to do is engage with the artwork at more of a curiosity level, and kind of me as an artist invite their curiosity, their intrigue, them try and give them a sense of mystery. What is it that I'm looking at? And then leave a few little nuggets in the image, whether it be a bird that's at micro scale, and they go, oh, that's a bird, that's what I'm looking at. Or whether it's a crocodile, which I love doing when I photograph up in the territory, is just zooming in and trying to find little nuggets like that, which kind of anchors that reference point, but they've got to search to find it.
Yeah.
So by angling my perspective down and removing the horizon, it really then enables me to focus on a number of key aspects, which include texture. That gives the image a sense of tactility and touch. Pattern, which gives the image a sense of rhythm. Shape, it creates a path for your eye to follow throughout the scene. balance, which is the manifestation of visual weights within the contrast. Is it light and dark? Is it rough and smooth? Is it small or large? Just gives the image energy and variation, and of course color. And I like to play with color and put color in unexpected color in unexpected locations.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of aerial photographers love to push the limits when it comes to editing their images. I try and tread the tightrope of not going too far and just trying to leave it as I saw it, only do some minimal adjustments. So I'm really trying to rely on the landscape to be the master artist.
Yeah.
And it's up to me just to find interpretations of that.
Cool. With most of your work now being focused on aerial, do you do any terrestrial photography, or have you left that behind?
I'm a dad of 2 young kids, so trying to find time is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Whilst most of my imagery is aerial and aerial-based, I still do have a love of terra firma and photographing on the ground. I was in Tassie over the last weekend, and of course, I was so fortunate that it was the largest aurora in 20 plus years. So yeah, my camera was on its tripod for the first time over the last 12 months, photographing the sky. Yeah, look, I will absolutely take photographs on the ground. It's just trying to find the time to do so has been difficult, particularly balancing family life with 2 young kids, work life with what can be a hectic career sometimes. Only having 4 weeks annual leave per year, of which 2 of it usually gets soaked up at Christmas. So yeah, just trying to find the opportunities is pretty thin for photographing on terra firma. But what that then has enabled me to do from an aerial standpoint is, as I said, aerial photography is so high yielding that I can go out to a location over a long weekend and I can come home with a couple of thousand images.
Yeah.
And that'll keep me busy for 6 months.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've really found the sweet spot in terms of being able to produce imagery, but then obviously not spend too much time in the field that I would spend away from my family, because they're my number one reason for doing what I do, right? And I want to spend time with them.
Yeah, fair enough. In terms of the process that you've taken to perfect or get as near to perfection as you can, because I don't think anyone's ever taken the perfect photograph. There's always to look at.
It's been eluding me for 15 years. I'm still in search of it. Please let me know when you find it.
I've taken some good ones, but never the perfect one.
Exactly.
But in terms of trying and attempting to perfect that, I want to talk a little bit about that process of learning how to take a good aerial photo. And you mentioned removing the horizon from the frame, which helps but focus the viewer attention.
Exactly.
Where did that sort of come from in terms of experimentation, and how long do you think it took you to start to go, okay, here's what I need to do to make this as I can?
I think they say mastery comes after 10,000 hours. I'm not even a fraction of my way to 10,000 hours in an aircraft. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm even close to perfection. And I stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of the photographic industry.
Yep.
So Richard Orr, who unfortunately passed away this year, really was the trailblazer when it came to aerial photography in Australia. He came out to Australia from the Netherlands in the 1950s and soon after was flying around the country photographing from an aircraft. And in more contemporary, in contemporary photography, there's been groups like ND5 with Tony Hewitt, Peter Eastway, Christian Fletcher, and the Light Collective guys who really have blazed the trail when it comes to aerial photography. So I just feel like I'm one in a long line of aerial photographers in Australia. The reason why I think Australia produces the best aerial photographers, I am unwaveringly firm in my belief that Australia has the best aerial landscapes in the world, which comes back to my favourite quote, who's actually from a pilot from the 1930s by the name of Nancy Bird Walton, who was one of Australia's famous aviation explorers. So she says, "The beauty of the air from the air. You haven't seen Australia unless you've seen it from the air. The coastline, the colours of the inland, the clay pans, the forests, it's all just so beautiful. And you'd never see it from the road. People climb mountains to see it, but you see it every time that you take off." That really resonates with me, because every time I take off, I'm immediately searching for new compositions, and it's almost like translating spatial mapping into a game. So it's trying to find features and elements that enable me to tell a story about place is what I find most enjoyment from. There's a sense of freedom of being in the air, scanning the landscape for shapes and textures and forms. It's all consuming. I feel that aerial photography provides me with a unique perspective to explore my passion for photography, as what may seem ordinary from the ground can be extraordinary from above.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of practice makes perfect, I think, and I'm always in the pursuit of perfection, and I'm never pleased with the results I get. 100% pleased with the results I get, and I think that just adds fuel to the fire in terms of my thirst for trying to get better and my thirst for trying to find perfection. And I know I'll never find it, but the more that I do it, the closer to it I know I'm getting.
Yeah. What does success look like for your photography?
I don't think there is. I can't define success tangibly.
Okay.
If I find enjoyment in doing what I'm doing, then that to me is success.
Yeah.
I know to many others, it may be winning competitions or getting 1,000 likes or having a successful photographic business. But for me, the pursuit of photographing and having the ability, and I know I'm very lucky to do what I do, and not many people could potentially even afford to get in a helicopter or an aircraft. So I know I'm very fortunate in that regard. But to me, that is success. And being in a light aircraft, flying out the remote Kimberley, that is the most incredible experience. It's exhilarating. I've got adrenaline running through my bones. I'm doing what I love doing. That to me is success.
You mentioned the cost. And as you said, for many, that's not an experience that many photographers can afford. And certainly in the current economic climate, there's a lot of people that'll never be able to afford that.
Yeah, exactly.
What sort of costs are we talking about? You've got the fuel, you've got the pilot.
Oh, there's so many variables there, Grant. So I guess that all comes down to the planning phase.
Mm-hmm.
I will do a considerable amount of planning to ensure that I'm in the right location with the right pilot in the right aircraft, so I'm not wasting money. So the cost of an aircraft can range from anywhere from kind of $3 an hour all the way up to a couple of $1,000s an hour.
Yeah.
So just understanding the types of aircraft, their limitations, and how that works in relation to what you're trying to achieve is really, really important. So you can have a Cessna 152, which is the smallest aircraft I've been in, and that's the cheapest aircraft that I've flown in, at about $350 an hour. And I was up in that aircraft for about half an hour, so it was about $170 for a flight, all the way through to flying in a helicopter in a really touristy spot can be really expensive.
Yeah.
I think the sweet spot for me is either flying in a Cessna 172, which is around $400 to $600 per hour. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if you share that with someone, then obviously it helps minimize the cost.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you doing much sharing to try and...
Yeah. So the Altitude South project that I was referring to earlier, there were 4 grown men in a 4-seater aircraft with all of our equipment for 3 days in the remote outback. There's not much room to even pass wind rather than do what you need to do for 40-odd hours in an aircraft. Having spent 40 hours in that aircraft, we were able to get things down to a fine art. 2 small windows, which were probably about the size of an A4, A3 sheet of paper on either side of the aircraft, and they have hinged windows. So we were able to put those windows out, and 2 of us would have to share one of those windows, would then do a figure of 8 and come around the other side just to ensure that the other person on the other side of the plane
gets a go.
Could have a shot as well. And thankfully, that aircraft was privately owned or owned by an aero club, so they can't charge us. So that was the most cost-effective charter that I was able to do, and that's just knowing the right people in the right places. The other thing, I guess, is just knowing which charter companies are closest to which photographic points of interest, and then trying to ascertain how long can I be in the air, do I need to refuel, do I have to refuel at any remote points across the potential flight path. So all these things factor into cost, and obviously you need to get to that airstrip in the first place as well. So getting from where I live to a remote airstrip also includes costs. But thankfully I've built my business to a point where it's self-sustaining. And if I don't ever make a profit from it, that's okay. As long as it pays for me to have these experiences, that's nirvana for me. And as I said, that's how I define success.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. In terms of, you mentioned having the right pilot in the right plane, in terms of the communication, both before you take off, but also once you're in the air, how important is it to make sure that the pilot knows what you're looking for, is able to get you at the right altitude and in the right position to get the shots you're after? How do you communicate that to them?
It's everything. So you've got to be really clear and concise in your communications, but I think it goes well beyond communication with the pilot goes well beyond you sitting in the passenger seat. For me, it starts at the planning stage. So I'll spend a lot of time on satellite imagery, trying to ascertain flight paths and things and get a good idea of where I want to be and what I want to photograph. Quite often I'll even print out either topographic maps or satellite imagery and drop pins on exactly where I want it to be. And I'll take that with me and show the pilot. When I'm briefing the pilot before we fly, I'll show him often, him or her, I should say, photographs of my portfolio and say, this is the type of images that I like.
Yeah.
Quite frequently, my images are top down. So I'll need you to, once we find a point of interest, just to do a nice tight orbit across that. So they, before we're even in the air, are familiar with what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And then once we're in the air, it's all about efficient communication, being clear with them, even using hand signals, using reference points like a clock. So I see something out to 3 o'clock. Can you take me there? And then just understanding what the pilot is able to do in the aircraft, how tight they can actually orbit a scene. Can you raise your wing? Can you lower your wing? Because quite frequently, some of the cheaper aircraft, unfortunately, have more restrictions. So you have wing struts and landing gear, and your actual real estate to be able to photograph is quite small.
Yep.
So you really have to be almost at one in synchronous. You have to be really clear in your communications. Everything's synchronized, and away you go. Yeah.
In terms of, you mentioned running your business and getting it to at least pay for those sorts of things. How much time are you putting into that versus time in the field versus family and work?
Family and work is the lion's share of everything I do. I have a very understanding wife, which makes life so much easier for me to be able to pursue my photographic career. And obviously my role here at work can be quite time consuming as well. I try and get out there and either do a long weekend or a week, 2, 3 or 4 times a year.
Yeah,
and that'll probably be it in terms of how frequently I'm out in the field. I literally just got back from Tasmania and I was down there for 24 hours. A weather window opened up and I had a flight path that I was really keen on. So I took opportunity to get down there and do that. And I'm very fortunate enough that it was also the largest aurora event in almost 100 years. So I got extremely lucky in that regard. Then obviously spending some time just to ensure that the resulting images are edited well. That takes some time, and quite often I just chip away at that at night after I come home from work and the kids are in bed. So quite often I'll just spend an hour on the computer just editing up a couple of images. I used to be really keen on releasing my work immediately after coming home from a trip. Okay. So I would edit well into the night and then try and release all the images. But I guess the more mature I've become in terms of my photographic career, I'm still sitting on images from a number of years ago now, and I'll just drip feed those out, because circling back to earlier in the conversation, what is driving me, the projects and my goals. If that project and the goal is the book, then that's going to be the ultimate outcome, not trying to drip feed something on Instagram and get the dopamine hit of a couple of 100 likes.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, I've become a lot more careful in terms of what I'm releasing. I think the buzzword in the photographic industry at the moment is let images marinate. I like to do that, and I often find that I get better outcomes instead of trying to rush them out the door, to look at them and look at them more critically.
Yeah, fair enough. What's the most important thing you've learnt from running your business?
Learn a lot about myself, I need goals and checklists in order to keep myself motivated and on track. I've obviously learned a lot about business as well, but I'm also in a career that's taught me a lot about business at a higher
Yeah.
level than that as well. It has taught me how fickle the art world is in terms of the saleability of images. When the economy's doing well, people obviously spend money on artworks, and as it has been over the last couple of years, it's been a lot more difficult to sell artworks
Yeah.
to the point where it's almost dried up entirely. So I'm fortunate enough that I'm not relying on that as my main source of income. And I think it would be very difficult if I was just trying to sell prints at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
It has also taught me that there is a direct correlation between success in competitions and getting your name out there and success from a selling perspective. So I was fortunate enough to do really well in an Australian geographic competition a couple of years ago, and there was a flurry of sales thereafter, which was, really good. But then obviously it's dried up subsequent to that. So look, it's taught me a lot, but most of all, it's taught me that I just love photography.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there is an insatiable drive there to get out there and photograph Australia from the air.
Yeah.
And that's something that I don't see stopping anytime soon. And that Australia is something that means a lot to me. It is the sixth largest country in the world. It's the driest continent except Antarctica.
Yep.
And there is an endless variety of aerial landscapes out there to photograph. And I think I'll be doing it for a very long time to come. So
Yeah.
that's probably the most important thing that it's taught me, is that you've found something that you love, and that's really important.
Yeah. You mentioned the fickleness of the art world, and I guess one of the questions that comes up a lot for photographers, but artists in general, is how do you maintain your artistic integrity whilst also catering to commercial or client demands in your photography?
I've never been in a situation where I felt I've needed to sell my soul. And that is a direct causation, or the direct causation behind that is the fact that I'm not relying on photography as my main source of income.
Yeah, yeah,
If I, and I have had some success in selling some prints, but as I said, the prevailing macroeconomic conditions have meant that a lot of people don't have extra money to be spending on prints at the moment. If I had made the decision some time ago that I was going to pursue photography as my full-time profession, I know that I would be struggling right now.
yeah,
And I would have had to face some of those difficult decisions around selling my artistic integrity. So thankfully, I am in a position where I have found harmony in terms of having a full-time profession and having photographic pursuits on the side that hasn't pushed me to a point where I need to compromise on my values.
yeah, cool. What about printing? Are you doing that yourself, or are you doing that through a printer?
I'm doing it through a third-party lab. Unfortunately, that lab's just closed, so I'm in the market to try and find a new lab. So if you're running a print lab, hit me up. No, so I would love to get into printing. The amount of times I've been on a website ready to hit bot purchase on a new Canon printer or an Epson printer has been too many times to count. But yeah, I think sometimes my risk adverse nature comes back to save me and say, Tim, you don't need to spend $2,000 right now. You can spend that $2,000 on a flight out at Uluru. Go do that.
Yeah, the problem is it's not just the $2,000 for the printer; it's then
The ongoing costs. Yeah,
paper,
yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. So by the time you actually do the sums on it as an accountant, you start
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. She's all about cost benefit. And at the moment, I'm getting more benefit out of being out in nature and in an aircraft exploring some pretty
definitely.
cool places. Yeah, yeah.
What's the furthest you've travelled to get a shot?
Oh, I feel like I've now traveled to pretty much every corner of Australia.
Okay.
The furthest I've ever traveled in an aircraft would have been from Port Pirie near Adelaide, about 3 hours north on the road from Adelaide, on the Spencer Gulf there, all the way up to Birdsville. And as I said, that was about 4 hours, 40 hours in an aircraft over the course of 4 days or thereabouts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've had the benefit of spending some time up in the Kimberley. My sister lives up in the Northern Territory, and I love going to visit her and her husband and her kids, spend some time with the family, and then get out to Kakadu. I had an incredible experience photographing Kakadu from the air 18 months ago, and just the spirituality of that place just really hit me hard.
Yeah.
The there was a huge amount of environmental energy that I just felt, huge flocks of birds, and the life is teeming there, and it's just exploding with spirituality, and you can understand why it's so meaningful to the Indigenous Australians up there. I even managed to capture an image that I felt was like the rainbow serpent,
Okay.
and you can see how easily and how transferable a lot of those Dreamtime stories are. The birthplace of those Dreamtime stories is in the land itself.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really love exploring the relationship that the Indigenous Australians have with their country. I take a lot of inspiration from the Indigenous painters of the Central Deserts, from places like Utopia. Whilst it's quite a contemporary movement, they've only been using acrylic paints since the 1960s, I believe. The stories that they're telling are ancient, and the correlation between their paintings and the landscape, particularly when seen from above, is mind-boggling. And they're telling stories of place. They're telling stories of where to go. So a lot of what they're saying, the dot paintings are almost like a spatial map. And they're saying certain iconography represents places, things like waterholes, for instance.
Yep.
I take great enjoyment in trying to almost replicate or mimic some of the Indigenous artworks through my photographic pursuit. So yeah, I've been everywhere, man.
Have you got a favourite spot or a spot that you've got unfinished business with?
I would definitely say the Northern Territory of Australia. Every time I go back there, the annual wet season means that it's forever changing. And the conditions that you get in the territory are always different. You've got quite dynamic tides. So the tides can get up to 12 meters, which means that even the seabed is never the same.
Yeah.
Dry season also has its benefits because it dries out a lot of the landscape. It also concentrates areas of water and draws out things like minerals and salts, which create some pretty amazing textures and colors in the landscape.
Sure.
So yeah, it's forever changing. I think the Indigenous Australians say that there's 6 different seasons as opposed to 4 different seasons.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it's easy to see why, because there's so much variability in the landscape and it changes so quickly. So yeah, I definitely have a piece of my heart in the territory. She's a wild old place, and yeah, I always enjoy flying up there.
Yeah.
The pilots are always fun because they're always these green kids out of flight school, and they all of a sudden, instead of doing the mail run out to some stations, they've got a photographer who's asking them to do some pretty swift circle work. And our flight paths often look like a bowl of spaghetti. So it's a lot of fun when you're out there with these young cowboy pilots.
They're our future Qantas and Virgin pilots.
Exactly. I've even had one point where we're flying in the Kimberley, and I said, "Oh, what happens if you stall the plane?" And he goes, "Oh, what do you mean, like this?" And turned off the engine, and, da, 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 and the plane starts stalling. I was like, "No, turn that back on, please." I'm not gonna say which charter company that was because he'd probably lose his job.
What's your most memorable experience?
Oh, so my first ever photographic shoot in the Northern Territory, and it was really a sentimental portfolio for me. My sister was living in Katherine at the time, which is 3 hours south of Darwin. I had done a little bit of research, and I really wanted to get to I guess you'd say it's the western side of the Gulf of Carpentaria. So it's where the Roper River, which is the longest river in the Northern Territory, enters into the Gulf of Carpentaria, and it's an area called the Limb and Bight. I was fortunate enough that Katherine isn't a very big town, and my brother-in-law was able to be my foot on the ground and get me in direct correspondence with the owner of the charter company. And he called me, and we just put our heads together and goes, "Yeah, I reckon there'd be some pretty cool things out there." And I said, "Let's do it." And I was very fortunate enough that we were visiting Katherine as a family. So I had my dad with me. So dad came along and sat in the back seat of the aircraft, and we flew out about 400 kilometres to the east of Katherine, landed at a remote Indigenous community called Nooka. And then from Nooka, we spent a good few hours just photographing over the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Limb and Bight. And I came back with a portfolio of images which really changed course in terms of how I saw the landscape and how I interpreted the landscape from above, and really gave me a zest and a love for the Northern Territory and exploring some remote places. So I continue to explore some remote locations and try and get off the beaten track in terms of some of the locations. There's some parts of Australia which are really quite famous for aerial photography. You've got Lake Eyre, you've got Shark Bay. These are the meccas of aerial photography. But yeah, I try and push the envelope a little bit and get a little bit further abroad from some of those places that seem to attract people, like bees to a honeypot.
Yeah, nice. What have you learned about
I
nature?
think it was most memorable because I got to share it with my dad, and it was the first real expedition style photographic aerial shoot that I've done that I took a chance, and that chance paid off.
Yeah, cool.
I've got some bad memories as well. I went canyon in 2012 with my 617 camera in Clostrel Canyon up in the Blue Mountains, and got lost on the way out, and then we had to abseil back down into the ravine, and the rope wasn't long enough, and all sorts of horror stories like that.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, it was very fun, but it was the closest I've felt to the man upstairs. And in fact, I felt the closest I've ever felt, and having done a lot of backcountry stuff up in the Alpine, to actually hitting the trigger on an EPIRB. But yeah, managed to get out of that safe and sound. So huge amount of memorable experiences. Even watching the aurora down in Tassie on Saturday night will be something that I'll never forget. It felt the sky was so alive with the aurora. It felt like the universe was collapsing in on itself. It was just
fabulous.
So yeah, I've got countless memories, Grant. Yeah, but yeah, they're just a couple that stand out.
Fantastic, thanks. What have you learned about nature through photography?
I've learned how vulnerable nature is. Look, I don't consider myself to be environmental advocate or anything like that, but when I see something that I don't feel comfortable with, I feel like it's my obligation to speak up. So as I said earlier, having seen places like a swamp that was dead because of the impact of man, really made me take stock and consider the impacts that we're having on the environment. What has it taught me about nature? First and foremost, it's taught me that nature is vulnerable, but it is also resilient. So having flown out over some remote mines in South Australia, these mines are they're so remote and so far removed from the general population that we don't actually understand what's going on there. Some of the processes are so ghastly that they create some very unnatural toxic colours. But nevertheless, nature thriving side by side with some of these processes. So whilst nature is vulnerable, she keeps on carrying on and adapts. So yeah, it's taught me a lot about nature and what we do with nature. It's also given me a voice to try and help nature. But yeah, above all, it's taught me that it's powerful and it's beautiful, and I just love it.
Yeah, cool. Have you ever got sick of it all and just wanted to chuck it all in and hit that creative wall where you just go, I'm not feeling it, can't do it?
I've hit creative walls, absolutely, but I've never felt inclined to chuck it in. Photography for me, and I feel this is probably because I've never actually, and I am absolutely risk adverse, and I've always never seen it as a full-time pursuit. So whilst I've had a full-time job my whole life, photography to me has always been a bit of a North Star. So it's given me the ability to, when I feel down about myself or I feel like I'm in a mental health hole or something like that, getting out there and reconnecting with nature and reconnecting with my love of creating imagery has kept me on path. So whilst I've absolutely hit creative walls, and up until recently, I hadn't touched my camera in 6 months, but I've never actually felt like chucking it all in. Never. No, the magnetic pull is too strong.
Yeah, fair enough. Where do you see the future of photography going?
Oh, I'm not a futurist, so I can't answer this question with any great authority. There will always be a place for storytelling. And I think the way that the world is going, there is more need for us to tell authentic stories. So I think that there will always be a need for a human and that human's interpretation of whatever they've got in front of them. Whilst everything that's going on in relation to AI and all this kind of stuff, I think that's only going to make the need for people and people trying to tell stories even more important. So I would like to think, perhaps optimistically, that there will always be a place for photography. I may be wrong with that. I may need to eat those words, but I don't. What do you think, Grant? What do you think the future of photography looks like?
I think very much like you that there's always going to be that human element that needs to be there. And till we're not here, you know,
Yeah,
which is likely at some point. But I guess while we are here, I think that storytelling element and that authenticity that comes from somebody reacting to something that they're seeing, and whether it's a beautiful sunrise or a seascape or a riot in an urban environment.
exactly.
From a journalistic perspective, somebody's going to be there with a camera, and everyone's got one in their pocket now. Yeah, I don't think that's going to disappear. I don't think the creativity and artistic side of things is going to be overtaken by anything like AI. I think, yes, some people in the photography world, that's already starting to happen, where models and product photographers or fashion photographers are losing out on business because
Yes.
marketing companies are saying, all right, I don't have to spend any money. I can type some words into a computer and get what I want.
Exactly.
Market economics say that will happen. It won't
Exactly.
happen for
Exactly.
won't happen for everyone in that business, but it will certainly, those in the high end that are willing to pay for somebody to stand there and model their product.
Yeah, look, I think
Will still
there's
do it.
been several revolutions across the art world over the course of millennia.
Absolutely.
When cameras first came to being in the 1800s, painters probably thought to themselves, "What about us?"
Yeah,
Yet,
I'm going to throw my
yet
brushes away.
painting is probably now more popular now than it ever has been.
Absolutely. And
You know,
bizarrely, from an artistic perspective, it's always been preeminent. Even other visual art forms like sculpture and other art.
exactly. The digital revolution in photography came in the early 2000s, and you
Yeah,
still see the hipsters out there with their film cameras.
yeah,
I just see this as another version of that. Whilst it will change things, absolutely, there will always be a need for storytelling. There will
yep,
always be a need for people to connect with people through images and
totally,
real images, authentic images. Yeah.
totally. What's your favourite thing about being a photographer?
Ooh, nothing's more exciting to me than the adrenaline that surges through my veins when the engine on a light aircraft splutters to life and I know I'm about to go explore somewhere. So I think there is, yeah, a real excitement for me in exploring new places from a different air viewpoint, that
Yeah,
viewpoint, the aerial viewpoint. That's what gets me most excited is the thought that I could go out there. I don't know what I'm going to capture. I've got an idea of what I might see, but it's all very exciting to go out there and to explore a new place.
yeah, no,
So yeah, I think that's probably what is most exciting to me. Albeit I love getting home. I love putting the images on the computer. I love getting into a flow state, editing my images. I love putting in my earpods into my ears and zoning out with some hypnotic music and getting lost in my images. I love all that, but nothing's better than sitting in the cockpit of an aircraft for me.
yeah.
Yeah.
What's your least favourite thing about being a photographer?
My least favorite thing about being a photographer is social media. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I
Don't
understand
we
it's
all?
necessary evil for all of us, but I find social media to be exactly the antithesis of what it is. It's antisocial. I've seen it drive people to points of mental health issues.
Yep.
I know that I need to get my work out there, but I'd much rather people view my work on hanging on a wall or in a book
Yep.
than in a tiny little 4 centimeter by 4 centimeter cube on a piece of digital equipment.
Particularly if you've got a panoramic image, they just don't play well on a mobile device in any way, shape, or form.
That's right. Yet I know if I had an exhibition, no one's going to turn up to the exhibition if I'm not promoting it on social media. So
Exactly.
there's a need for it, but yeah, I don't really enjoy it. So there you go. That's my least favorite thing about photography.
It's a good least favourite too. It's one of my least favourite things.
Yeah, you've got a podcast to promote as well, so you've got
Well,
to be
that's
on
it.
there
Yeah,
as well.
but it's hilarious when I get all the scammers on the podcast account in Facebook wanting to buy my work as NFTs, and it's clearly
Yeah.
done. You clearly didn't look at what I'm doing. Anyway, what's the best or worst piece of advice anyone's ever given you?
The best piece of advice is something that my dad said to me, and that is, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah,
And what we need to, where that translates into photography for me is you will always make mistakes, no matter, and we talked about the pursuit of perfection earlier.
yep,
You will always make mistakes, but the more mistakes you make now are the less mistakes you're going to make in the future. So therefore, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger.
Yeah.
Keep on soldiering on. You may have put $1,000 into chartering an aircraft and you might not get any images from it, but it just means that next time you charter that aircraft, it's more likely that you're going to get more.
Yeah.
So yeah, that phrase has always stuck with me.
Nice. What advice would you give to somebody that's just starting out in aerial photography?
Oh, okay. So that's specific. I was going to say follow what you love. Find what is meaningful to you and pursue that with 100% gusto. But I think more meaningful advice for someone starting out in aerial photography is try and find a lane. There has been a proliferation of aerial photographs, particularly with the drone revolution that's over the last decade or so. But find something, and I found exploring remote places to be my little niche. Find something that drives you, find something that you're passionate about, and pursue it with 100% effort. So I think that can translate into any form of photography. But I think specifically in relation to aerial photography is, there has been so many different aerial images out there. You might feel like you're just one in a herd, but find your lane and you'll get a huge amount of enjoyment out of it.
Awesome. Great advice. Who else should I be talking to on the podcast?
So I've got three for you. I've got a very good friend, Dave Dellenberg, who's located in the Barossa Valley. I'm lucky enough to consider him a very good friend. I've spent countless hours in an aircraft with Dave, and the most amazing thing is when we get home and we put all of our images on the computer, I'm always just floored by how he sees the world. It's so different to the way I see the world. His ability to it may seem whimsical, but he has an incredible eye for pareidolia and finding figures in salt lakes and faces and ghosts and shapes and dragons. And so he's an incredible photographer. I highly recommend speaking to David. And the second on my list is equally a very good friend. Adam is a full-time photographer. He's a real estate photographer, so works with real estate agents photographing properties for sale and for lease. But he's also very, very much interested in nature and nature photography. Adam has a love for Kosciuszko National Park and the southwest of Tasmania, and his eye is incredible. Whilst most people with a camera would go to Kosciuszko National Park and see all these big scenic landscapes, Adam actually picks out the tiniest of micro details and photographs with the macro lens. So he's got these tiny little snow intimates of snowflakes and little plants bursting through ice and things like that. And his portfolio is incredible.
Awesome.
And lastly is an American-based photographer out of Las Vegas, is David Thompson.
Okay.
So David, wow, his portfolio is incredible. I've had the benefit of spending a little bit of time with David doing one-on-one just for post-processing. The way he thinks about it, and the most humble guy. He just says he's a dude that points his camera at things. But I tell you what, if he's just a dude that points his camera at things and the resulting images are absolutely astounding, his eye is incredible. His processing is probably the best I've ever seen. It's so subtle yet so powerful. He'd be really interesting to hear from.
Awesome. Thanks very much for those.
No, my pleasure.
I got my last question, which if you've heard any of my episodes, you'll know is one of the most interesting questions I can ask.
Hit me.
How are you with pineapple on pizza?
I like pineapple on pizza, but I've got a pizza oven at home and I'm getting more and more into the Neapolitan style of pizza. So I'm getting pretty creative and pretty gourmet with the toppings on my pizzas. And I must say, rarely does pineapple go on my pizza, but I do. I do enjoy it. There you go. How's that for fence sitting? I've got splinters in my bum.
Well done. Well done. All right. Thanks so much, Tim. It's been wonderful meeting you and getting to know you a bit better. Where can people find your work?
Best place to see my work is my website, so www.timrate.com.au. But if you're on socials or anti-socials, as we talked about earlier, then I'm on Instagram and FaceBase.
Fair enough. Thanks very much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to Landscape Photography World. I hope you enjoyed the show and keep listening because I'll be joined by some great guests in upcoming episodes. You can find my work in this podcast at gruntswinburnphotography.com along with prints and photography gear. I'm also on Vero, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm Grant Swinburne. Hope to see you out shooting soon.